The first time I saw her, she was no more than a shadow moving through the snow, head bent against the wind. Each step left a small red bloom on the white ground, and the thin cotton dress clinging to her frame was torn at the seams. She reached my porch and gripped the post for balance, her breath fogging in the frozen air. "Please," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Don't let me die out here." I hadn't decided whether to answer when she added, "I could be a good wife to you." For a moment, neither of us moved, the wind whistling through the pines above. Then I stepped back and opened the door. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and tap like and subscribe if you've ever stood at a crossroads where one choice could change everything. I'm Calder Ridge, born in the Dakota Territory before the war, raised on hard soil and harder seasons. My father worked a trap line that ran nearly 20 miles, and my mother kept a homestead that never saw a hired hand. We learned early to take care of our own, to show respect when it was earned, and to keep our word even when it cost us. Sundays meant church if the weather allowed, and the rest of the week was work from first light until the lamps burned low. Money was scarce, but we managed mending what we had instead of buying new. Folks in town lived differently, merchants counting coins behind polished counters, railroad men riding through with pay in their pockets, land speculators talking big in the saloon. That was never my world. I stayed close to the land where what you had was built by your own hands and kept by your own grit. When I came south to the Arizona Territory, it wasn't for gold or cattle. I wanted space enough to breathe, a place where I could hear my own axe bite into the wood without another man's business in my ear. I built my cabin on the edge of the timberline, far enough from Salt Creek that winter storms closed the road for weeks. It suited me fine. I trapped for fur, hunted for meat, and kept my dealings with town short and few. Loneliness had a way of settling into the walls, but it was quieter than the noise I'd left behind. 5 winters back, I lost my wife to a fever that came on fast. Since then, I'd kept to myself. Folks in town stopped asking after me, and I stopped giving them cause. The seasons passed in their slow turn, and I learned to live with what was gone. But the land doesn't much care about a man's solitude. It'll test you all the same. Some winters, it's the cold that cuts deep. Some years, it's men with more greed than sense. This year, it was both. That afternoon, the light was fading behind the mountains, the air sharp enough to sting the lungs. I'd just set my rifle back on its peg when I saw movement through the trees, a figure coming slow, swaying with each step. No horse, no pack. Just a woman barefoot, leaving blood in the snow. She made it to the porch before her knees buckled, and that's when she spoke. She stepped inside without a sound, the door closing against the cold at her back. The heat from the stove reached her, slow working its way into her shoulders and hands. I handed her a wool blanket from the shelf, the kind meant to keep out deep-season frost, and she wrapped it tight without a word. The fire popped in the stove as I ladled stew from the pot into a tin bowl and set it on the table. She sat on the floor to eat, bent over the steam, the smell of venison and onions filling the space between us. I stayed in the chair by the door, watching her without pressing for a name or reason. When she finished, I pulled the top blanket from my bed and handed it over. "Sleep," I told her. She hesitated, then stood and crossed to the cot lying on her side with her back to me. The wind rattled the shutters as she pulled the covers to her chin. I settled back in the chair, boots still on, rifle within reach. By the time the fire had burned down to embers, her breathing had turned even, and she didn't stir again until morning. The first light came through a frost-rimmed window, dull and thin. She opened her eyes, blinking against the dim glow. I was still in the chair, my coat pulled close, watching the flames catch after stoking the stove. She pushed herself up slow, wincing as her feet touched the floor. The skin was split across her toes, and the cloth wrapped around them was stiff with blood. I reached for a tin of salve and a roll of linen from the shelf, setting them beside her. "I'm going to hurt you," I said. She met my eyes for a moment, then nodded once. "You do it then," I told her, stepping back. She took the salve in both hands and began working it over the damaged skin, biting her lip to keep quiet. By midday, she'd found her way around the small space without asking what belonged to who. I'd gone to the shed for wood, and when I came back she had water boiling on the stove and the floor swept clean. She moved careful, favoring her feet, but not letting it stop her. Outside, the sky was a flat gray, the kind that held more snow. I showed her how to stack the wood pile tight so the wind wouldn't scatter it. She listened once and didn't need me to repeat it. Her hands trembled from the cold, but she kept working until the last piece was set. Later, I took her out past the clearing where the trap lines ran. The snow came to her knees and her breath rose in clouds as she followed. I showed her how to check the wire without springing it, how to spot where rabbit sign crossed the drifts. She knelt beside one snare, the frost catching in her hair, and reset it without my hand guiding hers. We moved at my pace, slow and steady, the limp in my right leg marking each step. By the time we returned to the cabin, the light was sinking and the air had turned sharp again. She didn't head for the cot. Instead, she found a broom by the door and began sweeping the corners. I set the day's catch on the table, 2 rabbits, and started cleaning them while she worked. When she passed by, the corner of her mouth lifted just enough to be seen. We cooked together that night, her slicing potatoes while I set the meat to boil. We ate in quiet, the kind that didn't press for talk. Afterward, she mended a tear in one of my shirts, folding it neat when she was done. I carved by the fire, the sound of the knife against the wood filling the room. By the 4th morning, she rose before I came back from checking the lines. Smoke drifted from the chimney when I reached the clearing, and the smell of pine kindling met me at the door. She had the stove going and water heating, her hair pulled back and her dress drying by the fire. I set the rabbits on the table, and she took them without pause, working the knife with steady hands. We moved around each other without getting in the way, no words wasted. That afternoon, a sound carried across the snow that didn't belong to the wind. Hooves. I set down the rabbit I was hanging and reached for the rifle. She stepped back into the shadows without me telling her. 3 riders came into view, their horses throwing up powder with each step. The lead man wore a red scarf, the others carrying rifles across their saddles. They pulled up short of the porch, the red-scarved one swinging down to the ground. "Evening," he said, glancing past me toward the cabin. "We're with the Salt Creek Watch. Sheriff's sending men out to check for squatters. Someone saw smoke up this way." I kept my stance in the doorway. "Ain't squatting. Land's mine. Built it 10 years back." His eyes narrowed a fraction. "You ridge I am," I said. He shifted his weight, sizing me. "Heard about you. Quiet type?" "That's the plan." One of the others leaned forward in his saddle. "Someone said they saw a woman here. Native." My grip on the rifle didn't change. "I live alone." The man in the scarf gave a slow nod, but didn't step back. "Thing is, a farmhand got jumped a couple weeks back. Folks think it might have been one of those Apache girls drifting down from the hills. Desperate ones." "Haven't seen anyone," I said. He studied my face, then looked toward the trees. "If you do, you tell the sheriff. We're not taking chances this winter." They turned their horses, the crunch of hooves fading toward the ridge. I watched until the last one disappeared between the pines. When I closed the door, she exhaled, her shoulders dropping. "They'll come back," I told her. She met my eyes. "I know." I asked if she wanted to leave before they did. "Do you want me to?" she asked. "No," I said. She nodded once, certain. That night the fire burned low as we sat close by it, her shoulders brushing mine. I poured her a cup of tea and handed it over. She took it both hands around the tin. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" I asked. "For lying." I shook my head. Didn't lie. I live alone. She turned slightly toward me. Not anymore. Outside, the wind shifted in the pines, carrying the promise of more snow. Inside, the space between us was no longer the space between strangers. Whatever came from Salt Creek, we would see it when it arrived. The days settled into a quiet pattern neither of us named. I rose early, checked the trap lines, and brought in whatever the snares held. By the time I returned, smoke was already curling from the chimney. She kept the stove fed and water heating moving through the small cabin like she'd always known its corners. Her steps were careful on the tender skin of her feet. But she did not let the pain slow her hands. When the snow eased enough, I took her farther along the ridge, showing her where the best sets lay. We worked side by side, the air sharp in our lungs, frost clinging to the branches overhead. She learned fast, asking little, repeating nothing. By the time we turned back toward the cabin, the light had gone flat, and the cold was sinking again. Her cheeks were flushed, her breath visible in short bursts, but her stride was steady. Inside, she went straight to work, sweeping the floor while I cleaned the day's catch. The broom bristles scraped against the plank boards, keeping a rhythm with the crackle from the stove. We cooked together, without needing to speak much, meat and potatoes that filled the room with their plain good scent. After supper, I carved at the table while she mended another shirt, folding it neat and setting it beside me without comment. By the fourth day, the lines of strain had eased from her face, though she still favored her left foot when she moved. That afternoon, the sky had a low, heavy look. I'd just set the last rabbit on the hook by the door when a sound rolled across the clearing hoofbeats. Slow at first, then more certain. She froze near the stove, her eyes shifting toward the window. 3 horses broke from the tree line, the red-scarved rider in the lead. The other 2 kept their rifles resting easy across their saddles. They reined up short of the porch. I stepped out, rifle in hand, but angled low. The man in the scarf swung down. "Afternoon Ridge," he said, his voice carrying just enough to reach me over the wind. "Making rounds again," I replied. He glanced toward the roofline, then at the smoke twisting from the chimney. "Sheriff wants the hills clear. Still some talk in town about a girl from the mountains causing trouble." "I live alone," I told him. His eyes narrowed a fraction. "That's so. One of my men swears he saw someone up here. Native." I didn't step aside. "You've had your answer." For a moment, no one spoke. The horses shifted, hooves crunching in the snow. Finally, he gave a short nod to his men. "If you see anything, you tell the sheriff." They turned back toward the trees, riding slow, their heads turning more than once before the forest swallowed them. I stayed on the porch until the sound was gone. When I stepped back inside, she let out a breath she'd been holding. "They'll come again," I said. She met my eyes. "I know." I asked if she wanted to leave before they did. Her voice was steady. "Do you want me to?" "No." She gave one small nod as if that settled it. That evening, we sat closer to the stove than before. Her shoulder brushed mine as I poured her tea. She took the cup in both hands, holding it near her face. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For standing at that door." I shook my head. Didn't say anything that wasn't true. I live alone. She turned her face toward me. Not anymore. The wind pushed hard at the shutters, the kind of cold that promised to hold through the night. I set another log on the fire, the flames catching quick. She stayed beside me, the quiet between us, steady and unhurried. In the morning, frost silvered the inside edges of the window panes. I headed out early to check the lines, and when I returned, she already had the stove warm, the smell of boiling water and fresh-cut kindling in the air. She wore one of my shirts. The sleeves rolled her hair tied back to keep it from falling into her eyes. We worked in the clearing that afternoon, stacking wood and setting a new snare at the edge of the timber line. Her fingers were quick, the wire bending clean under her hands. The sun was low when we came in the snow, taking on a faint blue in the fading light. That night, she didn't take her seat on the other side of the room. She sat near enough that the edge of her skirt brushed my boot. Outside, the forest was still, but I knew the trail from town was never as empty as it seemed. The wind eased for the first time in days, and a pale sun lit the snowfield in front of the cabin. Tala worked at the woodpile sleeves pushed above her elbows, splitting kindling with a rhythm that kept her shoulders warm. I was inside fixing the hinge on the root cellar door, the sound of her axe strikes carrying in steady intervals. When she came in, her cheeks were flushed from the cold boots too large for her feet, but tied snug. She shook off the snow and set the hatchet near the door without speaking. That afternoon, we checked the snares together, walking the cut trails where the snow packed firm underfoot. I showed her how to spot the faint track of a fox along the tree line, and she knelt to reset a sprung loop without needing me to correct her hands. We worked until the light thinned and the air bit at our fingers. Back at the cabin, she set water to boil while I cleaned what we'd brought in. We'd barely finished hanging the last of the rabbits when the sound of hooves came again. It was slower this time, a single horse. I stepped to the door rifle close and saw a rider coming up the path. A man in a worn brown coat and slouched hat, a shotgun tied to his saddle. He dismounted without knocking, his eyes moving from the trees to the cabin before landing on me. "You're Ridge?" he asked. "I am," I said. He glanced toward the porch where Tala had stepped into view. "Heard tell you've got company here. Apache woman." I didn't answer him. "You're not from Salt Creek," I said. "No," he replied. "Ride with a trader named Holly. She knew your wife." He paused, shifting his weight. "Came to tell you men in town are talking about rounding up the mountain women. Figured you ought to know." "Why tell me?" I asked. He looked past me toward the clearing. "Owed your wife a debt. This squares it." He tipped his hat to Tala. "Ma'am." Then he mounted and rode off, disappearing into the trees the same way he came. We stood in the doorway a while, after he was gone, the cold curling around our boots. Tala turned to me. "What does he mean, rounding up?" "Sometimes when folks get scared, they look for someone to blame." I said, "You're an easy mark for that." She nodded once, her eyes steady. "So what now?" "We get ready," I told her. That evening, the table was set with our supper, but we both kept to our tasks longer than usual. She sharpened the skinning knife, her strokes measured and slow. I cleaned the rifle, checking the sights and oiling the stock. The fire gave the only sound besides the scrape of steel. "You think they'll come here?" she asked. "If they do," I said, "they won't take you." Her voice didn't waver. "They'll say you're hiding me, that you're with me." "I am with you," I said. Her eyes lifted from the blade. "You're not afraid? I've been alone a long time." "I'm not looking to go back to it." She set the knife down and walked around the table, pulling out the chair beside me. Our shoulders touched the heat of the stove at our backs. "You said you lost everything once," she said. "So did I." I looked at her. "Then it means we've got something to keep." We finished the meal without much more talk, but the air between us had shifted. Later, she locked the door while I banked the fire. When we lay down, she stayed close, her hand resting light against my arm. The cabin was quiet except for the low crackle of the coals, and somewhere outside the wind had picked up again. The cold settled in, again the kind that stiffened the air before sunrise and turned each breath into a pale cloud. Tala was already up when I came in from checking the traps. She had the stove open, coaxing the flames with split pine, her hair tied back and the sleeves of my shirt rolled above her wrists. She glanced toward me only long enough to nod, before turning back to the fire. We worked most of the morning without words. She mended the corner seam on the flour sack while I sharpened my skinning knives. The sound of the whetstone on steel matched the soft pull of thread through cloth. Around midday, I stepped outside to stack more wood under the eaves, and when I came back in, She was standing at the table, her eyes fixed on me in a way she hadn't before. "You could have taken what I offered that first night," she said. I set the last log beside the hearth. I didn't want someone afraid. Her gaze didn't shift. And I don't want to pay for a place to stay. We stood that way a moment, the fire giving off the only sound in the room. Then she crossed the space between us and sat on the edge of the cot. "Sit," she said. I moved slow, my right leg stiff from the cold. When I sat, she didn't touch me right away. "I feel safe here," she said. "You are," I told her. She studied my face, searching for something in the lines there. Then she leaned forward, her lips brushing mine, tentative at first, as if testing the ground before taking another step. I didn't pull away. The kiss deepened, still slow, neither of us in any hurry. When we pulled back, she rested her forehead against mine. For a while, we just breathed in the warmth between us. Then she shifted closer, my hands finding her waist. The night stretched quiet around us, the world outside held at bay by timber walls and a banked fire. We didn't rise early the next morning. The light through the window had changed by the time we left the bed, the snow bright enough to make the clearing almost white. I went out to chop kindling while she gathered what was left of the rabbit from the night before and set it to stew. That afternoon, the sky thinned to a pale blue, the wind dropping enough to work outside without bracing against it. We reset 2 traps and checked the line near the lower creek, the ice there breaking in slow shifts along the bank. Her pace matched mine, her steps, sure even where the drifts reached her knees. Back at the cabin, she set a kettle on the stove for tea. I was still hanging the last of the pelts when she stepped beside me. "I'm not leaving," she said, her voice even. I met her eyes. Good. The fire caught in the stove, throwing a steady heat. She poured the tea into 2 cups and handed me one. We drank without speaking, but the quiet was different now, less like holding back and more like knowing what didn't need to be said. That evening, she took the chair by the fire while I carved at the table. The piece of pine I'd been working had taken the shape of a comb, smoothed along the edges. When I set it down, she looked over. "Is it for me?" "Yes," I said. She turned it in her hands, the firelight catching in her hair as she pulled it back to run the comb through. "Why, your hair's always in your eyes." She smiled faintly at that, finishing the stroke before setting it on the table. Outside, the wind had started to move through the trees again. The sound was low, but it carried a reminder that the ridge was never entirely out of reach from the world beyond it. We banked the fire early and set the latch on the door. She drew the blankets up when we lay down, her head finding its place against my shoulder. "If they come back from Salt Creek," she said, "we'll face it together." I answered with a nod, the heat from the stove still holding in the room. Her breathing evened, and before long the wind outside was the only thing moving. The morning broke quiet, a thin frost settling over the porch boards. I was pulling on my coat when Tala stepped outside, her breath hanging in the cold air. She stood beside me for a moment, her eyes scanning the tree line as if measuring the day ahead. Without a word, she followed me down toward the lower ridge, where the traps lay buried under fresh snow. We found 2 rabbits in the snares, one empty loop hanging slack. She carried them back without complaint, the weight swinging from her gloved hand. By the time we reached the cabin, the smell of wood smoke from our own chimney reached us. She went straight to the stove, laying the rabbits on the table while I set the kettle on to boil. We worked side by side, her knife moving with a quiet precision. It was the kind of morning that might have passed without remark, but for the sound that came after midday, hoofbeats, again heavier than before. I set the skinning blade down and crossed to the door, taking the rifle from its hook. 4 riders came into the clearing snow, kicking up under their horses' hooves. At the front was the man in the red scarf, the same one from before. Beside him rode another, wearing a tarnished badge, though I knew Salt Creek hadn't seen a real sheriff in years. The 2 behind kept their rifles low but ready. They stopped short of the porch. The man in the scarf called out, "You harboring an Apache girl, Ridge?" No one here you need to speak to but me, I said. He nodded toward the others. We'll take a look around. You won't, I told him. The man with the badge stepped forward in his saddle. This isn't a request. We've had complaints. By who, I asked. No one answered. The man in the scarf leaned a little on his reins. You planning to shoot us over this? I'll shoot any man. Steps past this porch without cause, I said. Behind me the latch clicked. Tala stepped outside, her chin lifted. I'm right here, she said. You don't need to search. The man in the scarf tilted his head. So you admit it? One of those wild ones from the mountains? I was, she said. Not anymore. I've hurt no one. I live here. He chuckled, glancing at me. Living here now, huh? That what you call it? She's mine now, I said. The words hung in the air. The so-called sheriff shifted in his saddle, but no one moved forward. The man in the scarf finally spat into the snow. Ain't worth bleeding over. But she'll be marked. Sooner or later someone else will come. Then they'd better come ready, I said. They turned their horses and rode out, the sound of hooves fading into the trees. I stayed on the porch until they were gone. Inside, Tala took off her coat and hung it by the fire. She stepped into my arms without asking. You said I'm yours, she murmured. I meant it. Then I'm yours and you're mine. I answered with a kiss, the kind that leaves nothing to be argued. That night the wind moved over the ridge, but the cabin stayed warm. We slept without waking, her hand resting in mine, until the first light touched the frost on the window. The snow had begun to soften around the base of the trees, patches of dark earth showing where the sun touched longest. Tala was on the porch, hanging a strip of washed cloth when I came up from the lower ridge, my boots heavy with mud. She glanced over her shoulder and gave a small nod, the kind we'd fallen into, instead of greetings. Inside, the cabin smelled of stew simmering low on the stove. She set a ladle aside and handed me a tin cup of broth. We sat at the table, the quiet stretching between us as the fire worked its way up the chimney. After a few minutes, she said, It's been quiet since they left. Quiet doesn't always mean they've forgotten, I said. Her eyes stayed on mine. Then we keep ready. I checked the rifle that evening, running a cloth through the barrel until it came out clean. She stood near the stove, folding the last of the dry laundry into a neat stack. When she came over, she rested her hand on my shoulder for a moment before setting the pile down. The next days passed in a steady rhythm. She mended gear without being asked, walked the trapline with me when the snow crust was firm enough to hold our weight. At night we ate together at the table, then worked in the firelight, her with a needle, me with a whetstone or carving knife. The air between us was easy, but there was an edge to it, like the ridge just before a drop. It was late one afternoon when the dogs down in the valley started barking. The sound carried up in sharp bursts before falling quiet again. Tala was at the window, the light catching in her hair. I joined her, scanning the far edge of the clearing. Nothing moved, but the air felt heavier. That night the wind shifted, bringing the smell of smoke that wasn't ours. Faint, but there. We didn't speak of it, but I kept the rifle within reach when we lay down. Her hand found mine in the dark and stayed there. The morning broke, still frost glittering along the porch rail. I was setting the kettle when she came in from the woodpile, her cheeks pink from the cold. No tracks, she said, but her voice was low. We spent the morning working, splitting logs, clearing a patch near the shed where the snow had melted enough to dig. Every so often I caught her glancing toward the tree line. By midday, the sky had taken on that pale, stretched look it gets before weather changes. She set the table early, ladling out the stew before I had even put my tools away. We ate slow, both of us listening more than talking. When the bowls were empty, she gathered them up, her movements quick and deliberate, then joined me at the table again. They might come, she said. They might, I answered. Her hand closed over mine, steady. Then we stand together. I held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded once. Outside, the wind rattled the bare branches, and somewhere beyond the ridge, a single crow called before the woods went silent again. By the next morning, the snowmelt had turned the yard to soft mud, and the air smelled of wet earth. Tala was already outside, her shawl drawn tight, scanning the tree line, as if she could read what lay beyond. I stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand, though the only sound was the creak of the pines in the wind. We didn't wait long. Just after midday, riders appeared at the far edge of the clearing, 3 men, their horses slow from the climb. They stopped short of the fence, one of them lifting a hand in a cautious greeting. I recognized their leader, Sheriff Tom Whitaker, a fair man when the law allowed him to be. He dismounted, mud clinging to his boots, and said, "Calder, we got word there might be trouble up this way. Thought we'd ride out before it found you." I glanced at Tala, who met my eyes without flinching. "Appreciate it, Sheriff," I said. Turned out the smoke we'd smelled had come from a camp not far from here, men who'd been asking after her. Whitaker had already sent word down the line warning folks to keep clear of them. He offered to post a deputy nearby until they moved on. That night, with the cabin shuttered tight and the fire low, Tala sat across from me, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea. "You could have sent me away," she said quietly. "Wasn't my thought," I told her. "You've got a place here, same as I do." Her eyes softened, the hard edges easing in the lamplight. We didn't speak much after that, but there was a calm between us, a sense that the worst had passed. In the weeks that followed, the snow gave way to patches of green. We worked side by side, mending fence lines, planting the early vegetables, and taking the dogs to the ridge at dusk. Word came that the men had headed south, leaving no sign they'd return. One evening, as the sun dropped behind the pines, casting the clearing in gold, Tala paused at the porch rail. When I was left behind, she said I thought I'd never belong anywhere again. I stood beside her, watching the light fade. Sometimes a place finds you before you know you're looking for it. The last of the daylight slipped away, and the lanterns in the cabin cast a warm glow through the windows. Out here, far from the noise of the towns we'd built, something that felt steady, something worth keeping. And if there's one thing the frontier teaches, it's that home isn't always where you were born. It's where you're welcome to stay. If this story has stirred a memory or a thought, I hope you'll share it. Maybe someone else needs to hear it too.